Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a pretty intense chapter of history today. Germany's hyperinflation in the 1920s.
Intense is an understatement, really.
We've got Adam Fergusson's book, When Money Dies, to guide us. He really captures the chaos of it all. Think wheelbarrows overflowing with cash, people's entire savings becoming worthless overnight.
It really highlights the fragility of, well, everything when a nation's financial system collapses.
Exactly. So our goal today is to understand how Germany, a major industrial power at the time, could be brought to its knees by something as, I don't know, abstract as inflation.
It all begins, of course, in the aftermath of World War I. Germany's facing crushing war reparations, political instability is rampant, and the economy is in ruins. Classic post-war scenario, but taken to an extreme.
So the government was desperate for solutions, and they made a decision that, in hindsight, had pretty disastrous consequences. Printing more money. I mean, at first glance, maybe that seems logical, right?
Well, it's certainly tempting.
Was the German government just totally clueless about basic economics?
Not necessarily. Their rationale was more, I think, about keeping the country running, paying workers, funding essential services, that sort of thing. But they overlooked a pretty fundamental economic principle.
Which is?
When you dramatically increase the money supply without a corresponding increase in actual goods and services, the value of each unit of currency, well, it plummets.
So it's like everyone's suddenly winning the lottery at the same time.
Right.
You've got tons of millionaires, but the actual things people can buy with that money hasn't increased. So everyone's money is basically worthless. I'm starting to see how this set the stage for disaster.
And that's exactly what started to unfold in Germany in the early 1920s. Prices were spiraling out of control. To add fuel to the fire, they'd finance the war largely through borrowing and printing money.
So they were already in a precarious position financially.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And they were incredibly resistant to raising taxes, which might have helped.
So increasing taxes could have helped to curb the inflation.
Potentially. But it would have been extremely unpopular, especially in the wake of a devastating war.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a tough sell politically. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And, of course, you've also got the Allied blockade to factor in, essentially cutting Germany off from international trade.
Right. The blockade significantly impacted their ability to import goods, generate revenue through exports, made them even more reliant on printing money. It's really a perfect storm of, well, terrible circumstances.
Speaking of terrible circumstances, Ferguson talks about this really dangerous myth that starts to take hold around this time. The Dolchstoß legend, or the stab-in-the-back myth. What can you tell us about that?
So this was a powerful narrative, but incredibly damaging. It basically blamed Germany's defeat in World War I, not on military failings, but on internal enemies.
Okay, so instead of accepting defeat, they looked for scapegoats.
Exactly. Politicians, socialists, anyone deemed disloyal to the war effort. And this deflection of blame had serious consequences. It fueled resentment towards the newly formed Weimar Republic, undermined its legitimacy from the get-go. You see this reflected in President Ebert's statement, for example, welcoming soldiers home as unvanquished.
Wow. So even in defeat, they were clinging to this idea that they hadn't truly lost.
It speaks to the psychological impact of the war, the unwillingness to accept responsibility, and it created this fertile ground for, well, let's just say, less than savory ideologies to take root.
It's fascinating and a little terrifying how this myth took hold so strongly. I'm guessing it contributed to the social unrest that was already brewing, the economic instability and all.
Oh, absolutely. The stab-in-the-back myth played on existing anxieties and frustrations. It offered a simple explanation for a complex defeat. It divided German society, and, well, things were about to get much, much worse.
Yeah, it's chilling to see how quickly that blame game can take hold, especially when people are struggling and looking for, I don't know, like easy answers. And sadly, as Germany spiraled deeper into this economic chaos, things were about to get a whole lot worse. Ferguson really paints this vivid picture of the Mark's decline. Did it happen overnight, or was it more of a slow burn?
Oh, no. It was terrifyingly rapid. Imagine going to the store one day, a loaf of bread costs a few marks, right? A week later, that same loaf costs hundreds, then thousands.
Oh, wow.
That's what Germans were dealing with. It was money literally melting away before their eyes.
So it wasn't just that prices were going up, but it was the speed at which they were increasing that created this sense of panic and uncertainty.
Exactly. People's salaries couldn't keep pace. Savings worthless overnight.
It makes sense.
It wasn't just inconvenient, it was this complete erosion of people's financial security, their ability to plan for the future, even to feed their families.
And, Ferguson gives that example of a chauffeur whose wages, even though they were increasing, couldn't keep up with the cost of milk.
Yeah.
It just shows how this wasn't some abstract economic problem. It was like hitting every aspect of people's lives.
Yeah. And that sense of helplessness, the loss of control, is a key theme throughout Ferguson's book.
Right.
It's easy for us to look back and say, well, why didn't they just, I don't know, barter or use a different currency? But when your entire monetary system is collapsing, there are no simple fixes.
No, it's true. It's like the rules of the game suddenly changed, but nobody got the new rule book, right?
Yeah.
He also draws some interesting parallels between Germany's hyperinflation and similar situations that were happening in Austria and Hungary around the same time. What were some of the similarities, but maybe more importantly, the differences?
Well, they all faced similar post-war devastation, right? So their governments resorted to the printing press to cover their debts. But what's interesting is how the social and political consequences of this hyperinflation played out differently in each country. Austria, for example, managed to stabilize its currency relatively quickly. They actually avoided the kind of political extremism that took hold in Germany.
So the economic turmoil was a catalyst, but the specific outcomes depended on, like, each nation's unique social and political landscape.
Yeah. And in Germany, this hyperinflation really played a significant role in undermining faith in the Weimar Republic, creating an environment where these extremist movements, particularly the Nazi Party, were able to gain traction.
And speaking of human impact, one of the things I appreciate about Ferguson's book is he doesn't just focus on the economic theory. He really brings these experiences to life through personal stories. What are some of the accounts that stood out to you?
Well, there's the story of a widow who resorted to bartering to feed her children. She had this small stash of pre-war coffee, traded it for food and other essentials. Her savings, her pension, they meant nothing in this new reality.
It's heartbreaking.
He also writes about farmers who refused to sell their produce for, this increasingly worthless paper money.
Really?
Yeah, they would rather let their crops rot than accept payment that would be devalued by the time they got to market.
So it wasn't just the urban population that was impacted. This was like the entire economic system being thrown into disarray.
Absolutely. And amid all this suffering, there was a segment of the population that actually profited from the chaos: the wealthy industrialists.
It's almost like a recurring theme throughout history.
Mm.
Those with power and resources often find ways to benefit from these crises, while the average person struggles just to survive.
Right. And this disparity fueled resentment even further, contributed to the political polarization of the time.
And then, amidst all this, there's a moment of, I guess, hope,
Yeah.
It almost seemed hard to believe after everything we've talked about, but the German mark is eventually stabilized in late 1923. Can you tell us about the introduction of the Rentenmark and how it worked?
Well, the Rentenmark was a new currency backed by something tangible: land and industrial assets.
Okay.
This was a radical departure from the previous policy of just printing more money.
So instead of just creating more paper money with nothing to back it up, they tied this new currency to something with real value. Okay, I get that. That makes sense intuitively. But how did that actually help?
By pegging the Rentenmark to these assets, the government was essentially signaling that this new currency had inherent worth, unlike the rapidly devaluing paper mark. This created a sense of confidence, which was crucial in halting the runaway inflation.
So it's as much about psychology as it was about economics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The success of the Rentenmark was largely due to people's belief in its stability. It provided this much-needed anchor in a sea of economic uncertainty.
But even with the currency stabilizing, surely there was still so much damage that needed to be undone.
Oh, absolutely. While the Rentenmark brought an end to the hyperinflation, the social and economic scars ran deep.
So what were some of the lasting consequences of this period?
Well, the middle class was devastated. Their savings, which were often held in bank accounts, government bonds, wiped out. They'd followed the rules, done everything right, and yet they were the ones who suffered the most.
It's like Ferguson really drives that point home, that hyperinflation disproportionately punishes those who try to play by the rules, those who trust in the system. It's a chilling insight.
Another consequence was this deep-seated distrust. Distrust in institutions, in the government, even in money itself. This trauma lingered for years to come.
And this lingering trauma, this vulnerability, I think that's one of the most important lessons we can learn from Germany's experience.
Yeah, it shows us that the consequences of this economic instability extend far beyond just the immediate financial hardship. They can shape a nation's psyche. They erode social cohesion and pave the way for dangerous ideologies.
Which brings us to this question that's been like at the forefront of our minds throughout this whole deep dive. What lessons can we, as individuals, as a society, take away from this incredibly tumultuous period?
I mean, one of the most obvious takeaways is the importance of sound monetary policy. Printing money with reckless abandon, as the German government did, it's a recipe for disaster.
So it's not just about having money, it's about the value and the stability of that money.
Right. Another key lesson is the importance of social cohesion. When people lose faith in institutions, in their leaders, in each other, that's when things really start to unravel.
And as we saw with that stab in the back myth, scapegoating can be incredibly dangerous.
It is.
It's a way of simplifying complex problems, diverting blame, and it often has devastating consequences.
It's about understanding that these economic crises are rarely simple or straightforward. They require careful analysis, responsible leadership, and a commitment to finding solutions that benefit everyone, not just a select few.
Yeah, it's like this period in Germany serves as a cautionary tale for all of us. It reminds us that economic stability isn't just about numbers and graphs and, abstract concepts. It's intertwined with social and political well-being.
It is, it really is. And when those foundations crumble, the effects can be far-reaching and long-lasting. Ferguson doesn't shy away from exploring some of those darker consequences of the hyperinflation. He talks about, for example, the rise of anti-Semitism during this period.
Oh, right. And that's a really important point. So
Yeah.
when people are struggling, when they're desperate for answers, they're more vulnerable to, simplistic explanations. Scapegoating.
Sadly, yes. And in Germany's case, Jews became this easy target for those seeking to explain the nation's economic woes. Blame for everything, profiteering, undermining the war effort, all completely unfounded, of course, but it gained traction in this climate of fear and resentment.
Yeah, and it's just a tragic example of how economic hardship can be manipulated to, I don't know, to fuel hatred and prejudice. And as we know, this scapegoating had horrific consequences in the years that followed. Did Ferguson touch on any other social or psychological impacts of the hyperinflation?
Oh, he writes a lot about the breakdown of social norms and the erosion of trust. People were constantly looking over their shoulders, suspicious of their neighbors, even their own families. It's really a testament to how quickly this economic chaos can unravel the fabric of society.
It makes you wonder, how did people even cope? How did they find the strength to go on amidst all this?
That's one of the things I find so compelling about Ferguson's book, though. Amidst all this despair and destruction, he highlights the resilience of the human spirit as well. He shares stories of everyday heroes, people who found ways to help their neighbors, to rebuild their lives, and to maintain a sense of hope.
So even in the darkest of times, there are these glimmers of light, reminders of our shared humanity. What are some examples of that resilience that really stood out to you?
He talks about community kitchens that sprang up to feed the hungry, barter networks that allowed people to exchange goods and services outside of the collapsing monetary system, even just acts of spontaneous generosity between strangers.
It's a powerful reminder that even when the system fails us, we can still find strength and support in each other. As we wrap up our deep dive here, I want to come back to those lessons we were talking about earlier. What can we, as individuals and as a society, take away from this historical example?
I think for me, one of the most important takeaways is the need for financial literacy. The more we understand about how these economic systems work, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions to hold our leaders accountable.
Makes sense. If people don't understand the basics, it's easier to, fall prey to manipulation, misinformation.
Right. Another crucial lesson is the importance of promoting social cohesion. Understanding. When we focus on what unites us rather than what divides us, we're less likely to fall prey to this scapegoating, this divisive rhetoric.
So it's not just about learning from the past. It's about applying those lessons to build a more resilient, just society in the present.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget the importance of, choosing leaders who understand the complexities of economic policy and are committed to serving the common good.
It's a call to action for all of us to be more engaged citizens, to educate ourselves, and to advocate for policies that, promote economic stability, social justice,
If you're interested in learning more about this fascinating and cautionary tale, I highly recommend picking up a copy of Adam Fergusson's When Money Dies. It's a gripping read. I think it'll challenge your assumptions and leave you with a much deeper appreciation for the fragility of, well, everything, really, when economic stability collapses.
And as always, we encourage you to continue exploring these topics, do your own research, engage in those thoughtful discussions and stay informed. Because ultimately the solutions lie in our collective wisdom, our collective action.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the tumultuous world of 1920s Germany. We hope you learned something new today, gained a deeper understanding of these intricate links between economics, history, and the human experience.